The morning sun painted the palace courtyard in shades of gold and amber. Princess Isabella, barely 8 years old, stood at the tall windows of her chambers watching the preparations below. Today was the annual Veterans Parade, an event she had attended every year since she could remember. The palace staff moved like busy ants, arranging chairs, hanging banners, and testing the sound system. But Isabella's attention was fixed on something else entirely. Down below, standing at his usual post near the main gate, was Officer Marcus Thornton. Marcus had been part of the Royal Guard for 20 years. His uniform was always pristine, his posture perfect, and his dedication unwavering. He was one of those people who seemed to blend into the background, doing his duty without seeking attention or praise. Most people walked past him every day without a second glance. But Isabella had noticed him. She had noticed him for months now, ever since that rainy afternoon when she had dropped her favorite storybook while rushing to her music lessons. Marcus had picked it up, dried it carefully with his handkerchief, and returned it to her with a gentle smile that reached his tired eyes. Since that day, Isabella made it a point to wave at Marcus whenever she saw him. Sometimes he would give a small nod in return, other times just a brief smile. Her governess, Miss Eleanor, had warned her that princesses should maintain proper distance from the staff, but Isabella could not help herself. There was something about Marcus that reminded her of her grandfather, who had passed away 2 years ago. Perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes, or the way he stood so steady and strong like an old oak tree that had weathered many storms. On this particular morning, Isabella had something special planned. Over the past few weeks, she had been asking questions about Marcus. She learned from the kitchen staff that he lived alone in a small apartment near the palace. The head gardener mentioned that Marcus often stayed late after his shift to help with heavy tasks, never asking for overtime pay. The palace physician told her in confidence that Marcus had been dealing with chronic back pain from an old service injury, but refused to take time off because he felt the palace needed him. The more Isabella learned, the more she felt that Marcus deserved recognition. Not the kind of formal recognition that came with ceremonies and speeches, but something personal, something from the heart. She had spent 3 weeks planning what she would do today, and she had kept it secret from everyone, even her parents, King Edward and Queen Catherine. She knew they would probably talk her out of it, saying it was not appropriate or that it might set a difficult precedent, but Isabella had made up her mind. As the morning progressed, the courtyard filled with people. Veterans from various military branches arrived in their dress uniforms, medals gleaming on their chests. Local dignitaries took their seats in the front rows. Camera crews from national television stations set up their equipment, ready to broadcast the event. The palace band warmed up their instruments, filling the air with snippets of patriotic melodies. Everything was falling into place for another successful Veterans Parade. Isabella's lady-in-waiting, Margaret, helped her into her formal dress. It was a beautiful creation of light blue silk with delicate white embroidery, chosen specifically for this occasion. Margaret fastened a small pearl necklace around Isabella's neck and placed a simple silver tiara in her carefully braided hair. The young princess looked every bit the royal she was born to be, but her mind was not on her appearance. She was thinking about the small velvet box hidden in her dress pocket. At precisely 10 o'clock, the royal family made their entrance. King Edward led the way, his military dress uniform displaying decades of service medals. Queen Catherine followed, elegant in a navy suit. Prince William, Isabella's older brother, walked with the confident stride of a teenager who had grown comfortable with public appearances. And then came Isabella, her small hand resting lightly on her mother's arm, her heart beating faster than usual. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Everyone stood with hands over hearts, singing with pride and emotion. Then came the speeches. The Minister of Defense spoke about sacrifice and duty. A decorated veteran shared his experiences from the last major conflict. The crowd listened respectfully, occasionally breaking into applause. Isabella sat in her chair, her back straight, her face composed, but her fingers kept touching the velvet box in her pocket, making sure it was still there. Marcus stood at his post throughout the ceremony as he always did. He was not part of the parade itself. His job was security, and he took it seriously. From his position near the gate, he had a clear view of the proceedings. He saw the princess sitting with her family, looking so grown up in her formal attire. He remembered when she was just a toddler, barely able to walk without stumbling. Time passed so quickly. As the final speech concluded and the parade was about to begin, something unexpected happened. Princess Isabella stood up. This was not part of the program. The queen glanced at her daughter with surprise, but Isabella was already moving. She stepped down from the royal platform, her blue dress swishing softly with each step. The crowd fell silent, confused by this deviation from the carefully planned schedule. Television cameras swung around to follow her movement. What was the young princess doing? Isabella walked across the courtyard with purpose, her eyes fixed on Officer Marcus Thornton. Her small hand clutched the velvet box in her pocket. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, but now that it was actually happening, her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Behind her, she could sense her parents' confusion, the crowd's curiosity, the camera operator zooming in for a better shot. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was reaching Marcus and doing what she knew in her heart was right. Marcus saw the princess approaching and instinctively straightened his already perfect posture. His first thought was that something must be wrong. Perhaps there was a security concern, or maybe the princess needed assistance. But as she came closer, he noticed something different in her expression. She was not frightened or confused. She looked determined, almost fierce in her resolve despite her young age and small stature. The crowd watched in absolute silence. It was so quiet that the rustling of the ceremonial flags in the morning breeze seemed loud. Photographers raised their cameras, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen. The television commentators whispered urgently into their microphones, speculating about this unscripted moment. On the royal platform, King Edward half rose from his seat, concern evident on his face. Queen Catherine placed a gentle hand on his arm as if to say, "Let us see what our daughter has planned." When Isabella finally reached Marcus, she stopped just a few feet away from him. The security officer looked down at the small princess, his weathered face showing confusion mixed with respect. He started to bow as protocol demanded, but Isabella quickly shook her head. She did not want formality right now. She wanted connection. She wanted him to understand that what she was about to do came from genuine appreciation, not royal obligation. Isabella reached into her pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a simple silver medallion on a blue ribbon. It was not an official military decoration or a royal honor. Isabella had designed it herself, working with the palace jeweler in secret. On one side, the medallion bore an engraving of an oak tree, strong and enduring. On the other side, a single word was etched in elegant script, gratitude. The young princess looked up at Marcus, her brown eyes serious and sincere. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear enough for those nearby to hear. She told Marcus that she had been watching him for months. She had seen how he helped the gardeners carry heavy supplies even though it was not his job. She had noticed how he always had a kind word for the cleaning staff who worked the early morning shifts. She had heard about the time he stayed late into the night to help search for a kitchen worker's lost wedding ring, refusing to leave until it was found. Isabella continued, her words flowing more easily now. She spoke about how true service was not always visible on the surface. It was not always about the big heroic moments that made headlines. Sometimes it was about showing up every single day, doing your duty with quiet dignity, treating everyone with respect regardless of their position. She said that Marcus embodied everything that service meant, and she wanted to thank him, not just as a princess to a guard, but as one human being to another. Marcus stood perfectly still, listening to every word. Something was happening inside him, something he had not felt in years. His throat tightened and he had to blink several times. He was a man who had faced combat situations without flinching, who had maintained his composure through countless formal ceremonies, who prided himself on professional detachment. But this small girl's words were breaking through all his carefully constructed walls. Isabella held out the medallion to Marcus. She stood on her tiptoes, trying to reach high enough to place the ribbon around his neck. Marcus saw her struggling, and without thinking, he bent down, lowering himself to one knee so she could reach. The crowd gasped softly at this gesture. Here was this decorated veteran, this proud member of the royal guard, kneeling before a child, allowing himself to be honored by someone who had not yet lived a decade. With careful hands, Isabella placed the ribbon over Marcus's head, adjusting it so the medallion hung properly against his uniform. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. She leaned forward and hugged him. It was a brief hug, just a moment of genuine affection, but it spoke volumes. It said that titles and ranks did not matter in this moment. It said that she saw him as a person, not just as a guard standing at his post. Marcus remained kneeling for a moment after Isabella stepped back. His hand had instinctively moved to touch the medallion, feeling its weight against his chest. He looked at the young princess, and she looked back at him with a small, hopeful smile. She seemed to be asking without words if she had done the right thing, if her gesture had meant something to him. Marcus needed to respond, but for the first time in his 20 years of service, he was not sure he could maintain his composure. The entire courtyard remained silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The moment stretched out heavy with emotion and significance. People held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The television cameras continued rolling, capturing every detail of this unexpected scene. On the royal platform, Queen Catherine had tears in her eyes. King Edward's stern expression had softened into something that looked like pride, mixed with amazement at his daughter's empathy. Marcus slowly rose to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate. He stood before the princess, this child who had just shown him more recognition and appreciation than he had received in his entire career. He was a man trained to follow protocol, to maintain professional distance, to never show weakness. But something shifted in that moment. Something fundamental changed, and what happened next would be talked about for years to come, not just in the palace but throughout the entire kingdom. Marcus brought his right hand up to his forehead in a crisp military salute, but his hand was shaking. His lips pressed together tightly and his eyes began to glisten with moisture. This man, who had served in active combat zones, who had stood guard during dangerous times, who had faced physical threats without fear, was struggling to control his emotions in front of hundreds of people. The salute he offered was not just a gesture of respect to royalty. It was everything he could not put into words. It was thank you, it was I see you too, it was you have touched something deep inside me that I thought was long buried. A single tear rolled down Marcus's weathered cheek, then another. He did not try to hide them or wipe them away. For once in his life, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to show emotion, to let the world see that beneath the uniform and the professional facade, he was simply a man who had spent years feeling invisible and unappreciated. Princess Isabella's gesture had cracked open something inside him that he had kept locked away for far too long. The princess saw his tears and her own eyes filled up. She had hoped to make Marcus feel appreciated, but she had not expected such a powerful response. She took a small step forward and gently took his free hand in both of hers, squeezing it softly. It was such a simple gesture, but it said everything. It said your feelings matter, it said you are valued, it said I meant every word I said. Marcus looked down at their joined hands and felt his carefully maintained composure completely crumble. He lowered his saluting hand and placed it over his heart, over the medallion that now hung there. His shoulders shook slightly as he tried to hold back the sob that was building in his chest. But it was no use. After decades of maintaining perfect military bearing, after years of pushing down his feelings and his needs, after countless days of feeling like just another cog in the machine, Marcus broke down. Not in a dramatic way, but in a deeply human way. His head bowed, his hand remained over his heart, and he wept. The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. It started with one person, a veteran in the front row. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and a chest full of medals stood up. She began to clap. The sound was slow at first, deliberate and meaningful. Then the veteran next to her stood and joined in. Then another and another. Within seconds, every veteran in attendance was on their feet, applauding. They understood what was happening. They recognized the emotion pouring out of Marcus because many of them had felt it too. The loneliness of service, the feeling of being overlooked, the exhaustion that came from giving everything and wondering if anyone noticed. The applause spread through the courtyard like a wave. Dignitaries stood. Palace staff members who had been standing along the edges moved forward, clapping with enthusiasm. The television crew stopped filming to join in the ovation. The palace band members set down their instruments and applauded. Even the police officers providing security joined in. The sound grew louder and louder until it filled the entire courtyard, echoing off the palace walls. It was not just applause for Marcus. It was applause for every person who served quietly, who did their duty without seeking recognition, who showed up day after day even when they felt unseen. Marcus lifted his head slightly, overwhelmed by the response. He saw hundreds of people standing, all of them clapping for him. His colleagues from the Royal Guard, men and women he had served beside for years, were applauding with pride and tears in their own eyes. The kitchen staff who he had helped were there, clapping enthusiastically. The gardeners were there. The cleaning crew was there. People whose names he knew and many whose names he did not were all united in this moment of recognition. On the royal platform, King Edward stood and began to clap as well. His applause was measured but sincere, and there was a look of respect in his eyes as he gazed at Marcus. Queen Catherine was openly crying, moved by her daughter's compassion and the raw emotion of the moment. Prince William stood beside his mother, clapping hard, a new understanding dawning in his teenage mind about what real leadership looked like. It was not always about commanding attention. Sometimes it was about giving attention to those who deserved it. Isabella remained standing beside Marcus, her small hand still holding his larger one. She was not paying attention to the crowd anymore. Her focus was entirely on the man before her. She watched his tears fall and felt her own streaming down her cheeks. At 8 years old, she might not have fully understood all the complexities of what was happening, but she understood the essential truth. She had seen someone who needed to be seen. She had acknowledged someone who needed to be acknowledged, and in doing so, she had created a moment that would ripple outward far beyond this courtyard. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Finally, it began to die down as people slowly took their seats again, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The ceremony that was supposed to be formal and predictable had become something much more meaningful. It had become personal. It had become real. The barriers between royalty and commoners, between ranks and positions, had momentarily dissolved, replaced by a shared recognition of human dignity and worth. Marcus finally found his voice. It came out rough and thick with emotion, but he spoke directly to Princess Isabella. He thanked her, not just for the medallion, but for seeing him, for noticing, for caring. He told her that in his 20 years of service he had received commendations and certificates, but nothing had ever meant as much as this simple gesture from a child who had taken the time to truly pay attention. He said that she had reminded him why he served, and that he would treasure this moment for the rest of his life. The young princess smiled through her tears and told Marcus that he deserved recognition, not just today, but every day. She said that she hoped people would remember this moment and think about all the other people like Marcus, people who worked quietly behind the scenes, making the world better without seeking applause or awards. Then she did something that surprised everyone again. She turned to face the crowd, still holding Marcus's hand, and she began to clap for him. She, the princess, was applauding the guard, and once again the entire courtyard erupted into thunderous applause. After the applause finally subsided, Princess Isabella walked Marcus back toward the royal platform. She kept her hand in his, guiding him gently. Marcus walked beside her in a daze, still processing what had just happened. The medallion felt warm against his chest and his face was still wet with tears, but something inside him felt lighter than it had in years. He felt seen. He felt valued. He felt like his service, all those quiet years of dedication, had actually mattered to someone. When they reached the platform, King Edward stepped down to meet them. Marcus immediately straightened and prepared to salute, but the king held up a hand to stop him. Instead, Edward extended his hand for a handshake. Marcus took it, surprised by the firm, respectful grip. The king spoke quietly, thanking Marcus for his years of faithful service. He said that Isabella had taught him something today about true leadership. Leadership was not just about commanding from above. It was about recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, regardless of rank or position. Queen Catherine came forward next and embraced Marcus gently, which was highly unusual protocol but felt completely natural in the moment. She whispered in his ear that Isabella had been planning this for weeks and had refused to tell anyone what she intended to do. The queen said she was proud of her daughter's initiative and grateful that there were people like Marcus who made the palace not just a building, but a home. Marcus nodded, unable to speak, his emotions still too raw and close to the surface. The ceremony resumed, but it was different now. The formal speeches that followed seemed more meaningful. When veterans were called forward to receive their official honors, the applause was warmer, more personal. People were seeing each individual, not just a group of uniformed figures. The television commentators struggled to maintain their professional tone as they described what had happened. Several of them openly admitted on air that they had been moved to tears by Princess Isabella's gesture and Marcus's response. During the parade that followed, something remarkable happened. As veterans marched past the reviewing stand, many of them would turn their heads to look at Marcus, who had been invited to sit with the royal family rather than return to his post. Some veterans saluted him, others simply nodded with understanding and respect. It was as if they were acknowledging one of their own, someone who embodied the spirit of service that they all shared. Marcus returned each gesture with quiet dignity, still touching the medallion around his neck from time to time, as if to confirm it was real. Princess Isabella sat beside Marcus during the rest of the ceremony. She did not say much, but her presence spoke volumes. Occasionally, she would glance up at him to make sure he was okay. At one point, she noticed him discreetly wiping his eyes again and quietly reached over to pat his arm in comfort. It was such a simple gesture, but it showed a level of emotional intelligence and compassion that was extraordinary in someone so young. The relationship between them had shifted from princess and guard to something much deeper. They had become, in a sense, friends bonded by a shared moment of genuine human connection. When the ceremony finally concluded, people did not immediately disperse as they usually did. Instead, many approached Marcus to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories of quiet service. A janitor from the palace spoke about working night shifts for 15 years, rarely seeing anyone feeling invisible. A young soldier shared how he had been struggling with feeling unappreciated in his unit. An elderly woman told Marcus about her late husband, who had been a security guard for 40 years and who had felt, like Marcus, that his work went unnoticed. The impromptu gathering around Marcus lasted for over an hour. Palace staff brought out refreshments, and what had been a formal ceremony transformed into something more like a community celebration. People from all walks of life mingled together, sharing stories about the unsung heroes in their own lives. The rigid social structures that usually defined palace events had melted away, replaced by genuine human warmth and connection. It was exactly what Princess Isabella had hoped for, though even she had not anticipated such a powerful response. Meanwhile, the video of Isabella's gesture and Marcus's emotional response was spreading rapidly online. News outlets had broadcast it live, and within hours, it had been shared millions of times on social media. People around the world were moved by the simple act of a child recognizing an adult's service. Comments poured in from every corner of the globe. Teachers shared it with their students as an example of empathy and leadership. Businesses showed it in training sessions about employee recognition. Military bases played it for their personnel to remind them that their service mattered. But more importantly, the story inspired action. People began looking around their own communities for the Marcus Thorntons in their lives, the quiet workers who kept things running smoothly, the dedicated employees who never sought attention, the volunteers who showed up consistently without fanfare. Social media filled with stories of people recognizing and thanking these unsung heroes. A movement had started, sparked by one child's simple act of kindness, and it was spreading far beyond anything anyone could have predicted. As the sun began to set on that extraordinary day, Marcus finally prepared to return to his quarters. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also filled with a warmth he had not felt in years. Before he left, Princess Isabella ran up to him one more time. She gave him another quick hug and made him promise that he would take better care of himself. She had learned about his back pain and his tendency to overwork, and she wanted him to know that taking care of himself was important too, Marcus promised, his voice thick with emotion again, touched that she cared about his well-being. As Marcus walked away from the palace that evening, the medallion still hanging around his neck, he felt different. The physical pain in his back was still there. The small apartment he was returning to was still empty, and tomorrow he would be back at his post doing the same job he had done for 20 years. But something fundamental had changed inside him. He felt valued. He felt appreciated. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, that his life had meaning and that his service had not gone unnoticed. And that, he realized, made all the difference in the world. In the days following the ceremony, journalists worked to learn more about Officer Marcus Thornton. What they discovered was a story that made Princess Isabella's gesture even more meaningful. Marcus had not always been a palace guard. His journey to that position had been long and marked by both sacrifice and heartbreak, though few people knew the details because Marcus never spoke about his past. 25 years earlier, Marcus had been a young soldier deployed to a conflict zone overseas. He had been engaged to his childhood sweetheart Sarah, and they had planned to marry when he returned home. Sarah worked as a nurse at a local hospital and wrote him letters every week, filled with news from home and dreams about their future together. Marcus kept those letters in his pocket during patrols, reading them whenever he had a quiet moment. They were his lifeline, his reminder of what he was fighting for. During his deployment, Marcus's unit came under heavy fire during what was supposed to be a routine operation. 3 of his fellow soldiers were injured, trapped in an exposed position with enemy forces closing in. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He ran into the danger zone, exposing himself to hostile fire, and managed to drag 2 of his wounded comrades to safety. When he went back for the 3rd soldier, an explosion threw him against a concrete wall, severely injuring his back and legs. Marcus spent 6 months in military hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries and painful rehabilitation. The doctors told him he might never walk normally again, but Marcus refused to accept that verdict. Through sheer determination and countless hours of physical therapy, he learned to walk without assistance, though he would live with chronic pain for the rest of his life. He received several commendations for his bravery, including a medal for valor, but the recognition felt hollow because of what happened while he was recovering. Sarah had waited for Marcus during his deployment, just as she had promised. But as his hospitalization stretched on month after month, something changed. The energetic young man she had fallen in love with had been replaced by someone dealing with constant pain, depression, and uncertainty about his future. Sarah tried to stay, tried to be supportive, but eventually the burden became too much for her. She broke off their engagement 3 weeks before Marcus was finally discharged from the hospital. She told him she loved him, but could not handle being with someone whose future was so uncertain. Marcus understood, but it broke something inside him that never fully healed. After leaving the military, Marcus struggled to find his place in the civilian world. His injuries prevented him from doing physically demanding work, and many employers seemed hesitant to hire someone with his medical history. He took odd jobs, moved from place to place, and gradually withdrew into himself. He had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, but nobody seemed to need him now. The medals and certificates packed away in a box in his closet felt like relics from another person's life. 5 years after his discharge, Marcus saw an advertisement for a security position at the Royal Palace. He almost did not apply, thinking he would not be qualified or wanted, but something made him fill out the application. Perhaps it was the hope that serving in this capacity might give him back some sense of purpose. Perhaps it was simply the need for steady employment. Whatever the reason, he submitted his application and was surprised when he was called for an interview. During the interview, Marcus was honest about his injuries and limitations. He explained that he could not run long distances or engage in physically intensive activities for extended periods. He expected to be dismissed immediately. Instead, the interviewer, a retired military colonel, looked at Marcus's service record and said that the palace needed people with integrity and dedication more than it needed people who could run fast. Marcus got the job, and it quite literally saved his life. For the next 20 years, Marcus threw himself into his work at the palace. It gave him structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging he had lost after Sarah left him. He never married, never dated seriously, never built the family he had once dreamed about. The palace became his family, and his fellow guards became his brothers and sisters. He took on extra shifts, helped wherever he was needed, and slowly built a reputation as someone utterly reliable and kind, even if most people did not know his name. But despite finding purpose in his work, Marcus carried a deep loneliness that never quite went away. He lived alone in a small apartment with few possessions and fewer friends. On his days off, he would often simply sit in his apartment watching television or reading, with nowhere else to go and no one waiting for him. He attended therapy sessions to manage his chronic pain and depression, but he never spoke about the emotional wounds that ran even deeper than the physical ones. 6 months before the Veterans Parade, Marcus had seriously considered retiring early. His back pain had been getting worse and he was tired. Not just physically tired, but soul tired. He felt like he had been working in the shadows for so long that he had become a shadow himself. Nobody really saw him. Nobody asked about his life. He was just the guard at the gate, present but invisible. He had started counting down the days until he could leave, thinking that maybe somewhere else he might find whatever was missing from his life. Then Princess Isabella had picked up his dropped book and smiled at him. That small interaction had sparked something. When she started waving at him regularly, acknowledging his presence, Marcus found himself looking forward to coming to work again. He did not know why this child's attention meant so much to him, but it did. It reminded him that he was still a person, not just a uniform. And when she approached him during the ceremony with that medallion, when she spoke those words about seeing him and valuing his service, it was like every painful experience of his past was suddenly given meaning. All the suffering, all the loneliness, all the years of quiet service had led to this moment, and for the first time in decades, Marcus felt like his life had mattered. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes that nobody had anticipated. The palace received thousands of letters addressed to both Princess Isabella and Officer Marcus Thornton. People wrote from every continent, sharing their own stories of quiet service and expressing gratitude for the reminder that every person's contribution matters. Teachers wrote about the janitors who kept their schools clean. Nurses wrote about the orderlies who assisted them. Business executives wrote about the security guards and maintenance workers who made their companies function. The letters kept coming week after week, each one a testament to how deeply the moment had resonated. King Edward, moved by the response, established a new annual award in Marcus's honor. The Thornton Service Medal would be given each year to palace employees who exemplified dedication and kindness in their daily work. The first recipient, announced 6 months after the ceremony, was a kitchen worker who had served the palace for 30 years and who had been known for her generosity in preparing extra meals for guards working overnight shifts. She received her medal from Princess Isabella in a ceremony that, while smaller than the Veterans Parade, was equally emotional. Marcus himself became something of a reluctant celebrity. Media outlets wanted to interview him, schools invited him to speak, and veteran organizations asked him to attend their events. At first, he was uncomfortable with the attention, but he gradually came to see it as an opportunity to advocate for others like himself. He began speaking publicly about the importance of recognizing service in all its forms, about mental health challenges faced by veterans, and about the power of simple acts of kindness. His talks were not polished or practiced, but they were honest and heartfelt, and people responded to that authenticity. More importantly, Marcus's life began to change in personal ways. The loneliness that had defined his existence for so long started to lift. Fellow guards who had worked beside him for years began inviting him to social events. Palace staff members who had previously only nodded at him in passing now stopped to have actual conversations. He joined a support group for veterans dealing with chronic pain and depression, and for the first time in decades he had friends who understood his struggles. The small apartment that had felt like a prison began to feel like a home when he started inviting people over for dinners. His relationship with Princess Isabella continued to grow as well. With her parents' permission, Marcus became something of a mentor to the young princess. They would have tea together once a month, and she would ask him questions about service, about courage, about life. Marcus found himself opening up to her in ways he had not opened up to anyone in years. He told her about Sarah, about his injuries, about the years of feeling invisible. Isabella listened with the same serious attention she had shown during their first real conversation, and she offered wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. One afternoon, about a year after the ceremony, Isabella asked Marcus if he had ever tried to contact Sarah again. Marcus admitted that he had thought about it countless times but had never had the courage. He assumed she had moved on, probably married someone else, and he did not want to disrupt her life. Isabella, with the directness only a child can manage, told him that not knowing was worse than any answer he might receive. She said that maybe Sarah had her own regrets, her own things left unsaid. Maybe it was time for both of them to have closure, whatever form that might take. Marcus thought about Isabella's advice for several weeks. Finally, He hired a private investigator to locate Sarah. He learned that she had indeed married but had divorced after 10 years. She was now living in a coastal town about 2 hours from the capital, working as a hospital administrator. Marcus wrote her a letter, not to rekindle their romance, but simply to tell her that he understood why she had left, that he held no resentment, and that he hoped she had found happiness. He told her about his life, about the palace, about Princess Isabella, and about how one small act of kindness had changed everything for him. Sarah wrote back 3 weeks later. Her letter was long and emotional. She apologized for leaving him when he needed her most, explaining that she had been young and frightened and overwhelmed. She said that breaking their engagement was the biggest regret of her life, and she had often wondered what had become of him. She had seen the video of the ceremony and had immediately recognized Marcus despite the decades that had passed. She had cried watching it, she wrote, both for his pain and for his healing. She asked if they might meet, not as former lovers necessarily, but as two old friends who had unfinished business to resolve. They met at a small cafe halfway between their two cities. It was awkward at first. They were both older now, marked by time and experience. But as they talked, the old comfort between them began to resurface. They spent 4 hours together that first day, sharing their stories, apologizing for old hurts, and slowly beginning to build a new kind of relationship. It was not the passionate romance of their youth, but something perhaps more valuable. It was friendship based on genuine understanding and acceptance. They began meeting regularly, and gradually, very gradually, something deeper began to develop again. Meanwhile, the impact of that single moment at the Veterans Parade continued to ripple outward. Companies around the world implemented new employee recognition programs. Schools taught the story as a lesson in leadership and empathy. Mental health organizations used it to highlight the importance of seeing and valuing people who serve quietly. The video had been viewed over 100 million times. And while some people watched it for the emotional impact, others watched it as a reminder to look around their own lives for the people they might be overlooking. Princess Isabella grew up with the knowledge that her simple act had touched millions of lives. As she matured, she continued to demonstrate the same empathy and attention to others that she had shown that day. She became known not just as a royal figure, but as someone who genuinely cared about people regardless of their station in life. When journalists asked her about the ceremony years later, she would always say the same thing. She had not done anything extraordinary. She had simply paid attention and acted on what she saw. That, she insisted, was something anyone could do. 5 years after the ceremony, Marcus retired from the Royal Guard at the age of 60. His retirement party was attended by hundreds of people, including the entire royal family. Princess Isabella, now a teenager, gave a speech about how Marcus had taught her about true service through his example. She presented him with a gold-framed photograph from the ceremony, showing the moment she placed the medallion around his neck. Marcus hung it in his living room, but what he treasured more was the new life he had built. He and Sarah had remarried quietly the year before, and they were making up for lost time, traveling and enjoying simple pleasures they had once dreamed about. The story of Princess Isabella and Officer Marcus Thornton became more than just a viral moment. It became a reminder of something fundamental about human nature. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to know that their efforts matter. And sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to notice them, acknowledge them, and express genuine gratitude. That quiet gesture from a young princess had moved not just one guard but an entire world, and its impact would continue to echo forward for generations to come, inspiring people to look around their own lives and ask themselves a simple question: who are the unsung heroes around me, and how can I let them know they are valued? Because in the end, that recognition might just change everything.